Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode number 10 of Entrepreneur Gains, where I interview Y Combinator alumni. On today's show, I have Liron Shapira, founder of Relationship Hero, an on demand, one on one professional relationship coaching service. They have over 100 experts available 24/7, helping people with dating issues, texting, marriage, breakup advice, and everything in between. Before Relationship Hero, Liron started a startup called Quixie, which raised over $170 million, but unfortunately ended up shutting down after 7 years. I personally worked at Relationship Hero as the director of marketing for a year and really look up to Liron. He is one of the smartest guys who I've came across personally in my startup journey, and his knowledge of startup concepts is absolutely unreal. He shares them in his blog Bloated MVP, which I highly recommend to everyone. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoy the episode, and any feedback or constructive criticism is super appreciated. You can reach out to me on entrepreneurgains.com. Hey, Liron, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Sabi, great to be here. I've been listening to the first few episodes, and I love that YC insider perspective that you're bringing.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it. I'm so excited for this episode because I work with you. I respect you a lot, and I'm so actually really passionate about what you guys are doing. So I'm really excited to talk about more stuff in detail and find out more about Relationship Hero. So starting off, first of all, I wanna if you can explain the guest what is Relationship Hero.
Sure, yeah. So Relationship Hero is professional one-on-one relationship coaching. So that includes dating issues, texting, very practical tips. It includes marriage, breakup advice, really everything in between. LGBTQ issues, like narcissism issues, military dating. Really, you can niche it down into a bunch of subtopics. But we have over 100 full-time coaches available 24/7 with any relationship situation.
It's amazing. Any numbers that you can share?
Yeah, I think the basic overview is we did YC in 2017, summer 2017. That's roughly when we started. So we've been going for like 3 years, and we've scaled up to about 4 million in revenue, and we've had a total funding of about 4 million. So it's all about that revenue to funding ratio.
Amazing. Love it. Awesome, man. And so how did you get into the startup world? Like I know you had a previous startup which was you guys did very very well, at least until the change in Alibaba's after they got public and all that stuff happened. But before that, you guys were absolutely, you raised a lot of money. And so I want to know the whole journey. How did you get into the startup world? How did you end up here, basically?
Sure, yeah. So you're referring to my last company, Quixie, which you can say we did very well in terms of we raised a ton of money, 170 million at the peak. Most of it was strategic capital, late stage from Alibaba. But in the end, we didn't do very well at all. We just spent all the money, and we had our one good contract was with Alibaba themselves, and they didn't really like us after a couple of years. They wanted to go a different direction, and so we basically had nothing, and the company shut down. And it was kind of a massive failure. So that's how I think about it in my mind. But in terms of my personal journey, I started Quixie back in 2009 as I was the co-founder and CTO. And that was about a 6-year journey for me. It was kind of my first job out of college. I'd only had another real job before then, working a year as a programmer, working for Slide. Max Levchin's company back in the day. It was kind of like the Zynga of the time. So that's basically my whole career in a nutshell before Relationship Heroes. I had this one big interesting failure of a startup, and I was a software engineer for a little bit, and I went to college and studied computer science. And now I'm here doing Relationship Hero, and this is really my second attempt at a startup, knowing a lot more, having a lot of the lessons of failure, so I know exactly what not to do. And I think this time I'm closer to making a real business that can last and create long-standing value.
Amazing. What made you wanted to go in the startup world, even with Quixie, because you were working at Slide, but how did that transition happen? How did you get into that?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, startups they just always felt like something interesting that I wanted to try. I kind of grew up with it. Grew up in the Bay Area, and my family was my dad was in software, and I'd been reading Paul Graham actually since high school, even since before Paul Graham started Y Combinator. I was already reading his essays, and he was putting all these ideas in my head. And then I went to college, studied computer science. And I also I'm naturally kind of like a contrarian, and I like to go out and start stuff. So it was always for me a question of like not if but when. And then Quixie was an opportunity where my co-founder had the idea, and I kind of said yes, and that was and then it kind of snowballed into its own big journey. And so the first time when I really made the decision, I guess, was Relationship Hero. Besides that one other experience, and I was seriously considering like, well, maybe I should get a real job. But I think the reason I wanted to try Relationship Hero is because I still, first of all, I had something to prove after my last startup failed so big. I still felt like, well, if I get another try, I feel like I know a lot and I can succeed. And the other reason is I really like the topic we were doing. So I was constantly, using dating apps and trying to figure out, how to send the best text. And it was something that I'd always talk with my co-founder about. And so the idea that we could just do this full time, helping other people with these same kinds of dating and relationship issues, that was very interesting to me. And I thought we were onto something in terms of an underserved problem. But yeah, I mean, I think just like in terms of the alternatives, like I'm not one of those guys who's like, oh, I could never work for somebody else. Like I would consider working for somebody else.
Right. Wow, nice. Okay. I actually really am curious about the how were you reading the polygram essays in high school? Like, how did you get introduced to them?
That's a good question. I don't even remember when I first discovered it. I don't know because it was in high school. This was like back in 2004. I
Yeah.
specifically remember I'd be sitting like in my study hall period, which was just like a free period where I was supposed to do homework and stuff. And I was just like reading Paul Graham, and I don't remember how I found it, but I just have a bunch of memories. Like I remember when he was saying how like the essays you write in high school are stupid, and I'm like, yes, this guy totally called these essays suck.
He gets it. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Man, that's crazy that you were like reading about that so early in life. That's so crazy. And I also think that, you have a blog and I've read your blog and like it's amazing like how much conceptual knowledge you have. I know you say that it was a massive failure, but even like running a company of that size, like I know I had 8 employees and I was like stressed the hell out. So I don't know how you had like raised that kind of money and managed that kind of team. You know what I mean? Your entire like that was it's a big deal.
Totally, yeah. But the thing is, when you have a bunch of money, it's kind of easy to make an organization, a failing organization. It's actually not that hard to do, right? Like if you look at WeWork, like a lot of the ridiculous stuff they were doing,
Right.
like it probably isn't that hard to replicate if once you raise the billions.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, that's a good problem to have, I guess. But so in general, like what like were there any ups and downs with like you're very like what I've known about you, you're very like you have your emotions under control. You're a very like logical person. You are like I've never seen you get like panicky or anything. So like for me, someone like me, when I was doing my startup, my journey, I was always like it was always ups and downs for me, like quite a bit. Has that been it for you, or has it been very like more stable kind of ride for you?
I mean, it's definitely kind of an emotional roller coaster, but I think I'm just somebody who naturally feels less emotion than average, right? Like my natural dial is turned down a little bit, and I don't think I'm actually good at controlling my emotions. So I think if I'm ever hit with like a strong emotion, I'm probably less prepared than most people because I'm like, oh, damn it, I'm not used to feeling such a strong emotion, so I'm probably worse at it, and it probably like takes me out of the game for longer. But the thing is with startups, even though it's an emotional roller coaster and I'm like, oh shit, we're on track to run out of money. Like I've had that feeling many times, which I think is common in startups.
Yeah.
Luckily it's been getting less and less over the years. Like we're, making some improvements. But when I do feel that, the nice thing is I can have that perspective of like, well, it's going to suck if we have to tell all our employees, that we're shutting down. Like that's obviously, it keeps me up at night, but it's also like, look, this whole thing is basically a game, right? Like I'm not gonna die if something goes wrong. Like I'm still gonna have like a loving family. I'm still gonna have like my own savings in the bank, and I'm still gonna live in a rich country, right? Live in the U.S. So I'm kind of like playing with house money, right? It's just like I'm literally like we raise money from investors, they have equity, but it's like this whole thing is just a game that I'm lucky to play, and the failure case is just not that bad.
Amazing. It's all about the perspective, isn't it? Like it's when you put it that way, it's so good.
Yeah.
Cool, man. I want to talk more about your blog. You started a blog called Bloated MVP. So first of all, what is a bloated MVP?
Sure, yeah. So, I like to think it's kind of a catchy title. Bulleted MVP, it just rolls off your tongue. And it's funny because that word MVP, like a lot of people outside the startup community have no idea what it's even talking about. But it's a trend that I've been noticing. It's like If you give me 10 random startup founders, have a conversation with them, I would say 8 out of the 10 are a bloated MVP, which is pretty crazy. So obviously MVP stands for minimum viable product, and a bloated MVP, my definition is just like you built more than you had to. So it wasn't even a good lean MVP. Like you think it's the MVP and it took you 6 months, but the real MVP should have taken you like a week and a half.
Amazing.
That's basically a bloated MVP.
Awesome. And how did the idea for bloated MVP come about? Like, I mean, obviously you've seen this a lot, talking to
Yeah,
other
yeah.
founders. Yeah.
Sure. So, I've always wanted to start a blog and like get a readership, but my bottleneck to starting a blog is I don't feel like I have something to write about every day, and or like I do, but it would take me like 2 hours, right, to like think of an idea and refine. So, I was always like keeping an eye out for the idea of like when can I start a blog where I just have like a theme, right, and I'm always like seeing patterns and seeing more examples on the same theme. And then finally last year, I'm like, I'm always seeing bloated MVPs. Maybe I should just start a blog on bloated MVPs because I keep having thoughts about the same topic. And I got inspired because I kept talking to startup founders and they kept showing me bloated MVPs. And I'm like, doesn't YC teach you not to make a bloated MVP? Like, haven't you read that book, The Lean Startup? And so I realized I think that the world has like another niche for like more content telling you not to make a bloated MVP.
I also think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I also think, because I know when I read Lean Startups about 8 or 9 years ago, and I made the same mistake. I definitely did have a bloated MVP multiple times after even reading the book or even like listening to Paul Graham. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's just very hard to like I mean, you can see examples of bigger companies and you can be like, oh, this was their MVP. But when it comes to your own company, I feel like a lot of times you don't know what that even means until you actually see examples, at least in your space, or you know what I mean, like a real, or someone actually explains it to you. That
Right.
makes it so much
Yeah, yeah.
easier. You know what I mean?
Exactly, yeah. And honestly, I think it's kind of juicy to take existing companies that have launched with millions of dollars of funding, with like you have a team of like these five smart people. Like these people could be making like 6 or 7 figures. They could be making $1 million a year at Google. And instead, they've dedicated, 6 months, 12 months to this project, and the project launches. And then, but when I see it, I'm like, wait a minute, you're not going to get any users. Like you just took all this massive brain power, right? These super valuable economic resources,
Yep.
and you're not even going to create value to a single person. It's like if you had just like opened up like a lemonade stand and like served somebody some lemonade. At least that would have been a value transaction. But instead, you did something which wasn't even like the most basic value transaction of giving somebody value.
And you think usually it comes from the place of like the ego, where like a lot of people are like so they want to so prove it to the, because we're in that era of like the Instagram and all that, where you just want to go out and say, hey, I'm an entrepreneur and I started a startup, where it becomes less about what you're doing than more about the outside perspective.
It's a good question, right? Like, why are 80% of startups bloated MVPs, even when everybody's reading the lean startup? Like, how is this still happening?
Yeah.
And I think it's actually the most fundamental reason that I've identified is actually it's a matter of thinking specifically. Like, the human brain is bad at thinking in specific detail, and we like to toss around these general concepts and we never make them specific enough. So, the startup idea, it's like, oh, yeah, I'm going to use blockchain to help you buy a house better because the blockchain will make your transaction like secure, more secure and anonymous. It's like that statement doesn't necessarily make sense, but you can see I built it out of general concepts. And I didn't say something specific like, imagine you're in the Bay Area and you want to buy this house for $1.5 million. Normally you would do this. You would go call up this broker and you would use this bank. But instead of that, now you can do this. So I'm starting to tell you a more specific story now. And most people's brains are just content to operate at a level where they only toss around general concepts. And when it comes time to like get a user, they just haven't thought in specific detail of like who is the user, where's the user coming from, what is the first thing the user does. They just stayed, they thought only in general terms.
Like a perfect, like an avatar basically, or a persona of a user.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they've made a persona, right?
Yeah.
So they might have asked themselves a question like, "Who's this for?" And they're like, "Oh, it's for Bay Area people looking for a better deal." So like maybe they'll have come up with a category, but they won't. If they've done really good work, maybe they'll narrow down the category to be like, you know what, it's for people in their 20s, right? So they can narrow it down further. But I bet that they haven't narrowed it down enough to be like, okay, what's their name? Like,
Right.
what's the first person's name?
Right.
They probably haven't done that, and that is actually a red flag because you actually want to give me an example of a few names of who are going to be your first users or your first customers. And if you haven't done that, very likely you're building a bloated MVP.
Interesting. Like I think it's pretty interesting because I think that so right now with my podcast, I started doing that where I got like 10 people, like 10 of my like people I know. I made a post on my Instagram and I was like, hey, Started a new podcast. Would love some like regular feedback. If anybody is into startups or entrepreneurship, just like let me know and I'll add you to a group. And I got 10 people together in
Hmm.
one group. And I think it's interesting that you say that because I see that a lot of time as well, where I'm talking to a lot of entrepreneurs. Their whole thing is going to be used by these many people around the world and blah blah blah. But the idea is, but like show me the first 10 people or first 5 people who actually use the product, let alone the hundreds of thousands of people. In like theory, the concept sounds great, but in practicality, like you know what I mean? Like so it's crazy,
Exactly.
but like even like with the 5 or 10 people, I'm like all I'm trying to do is make it better for them. And the goal is even if 8 out of them leave and 2 stick, then I know who these 2 people are and how do I find more of these 2 and make it to 10 and then
Exactly. I mean, just the fact if you can have two who stick,
yeah,
you're already better than 80% of startups. Like 80% of startups just stay at zero.
yep,
And I'm like, so, and the whole perspective of the Bloated MVP blog is like, look, if there's this thing that's killing 80% of startups, it's called not having a single user. Don't you think you should just focus on having your
one,
first user
yep,
before you do anything else? Like get to one, get to two, and then do everything else.
yep.
Because if you try to do everything else first, the post-mortem is going to be that you never got one user, statistically speaking.
Makes sense. And I think that's what PG says, isn't he? Like he said, like first you got to go, like not like you have to go like manually and get the first few users before you can go and scale that or whatever that was 50 or 500 or whatever the number was. But like depends on I'm guessing business to business, obviously. But
Exactly right. So technically, that's the funny thing, right? Is technically this thing PG has said all this stuff before. Eric Ries has said all this stuff before, right? In the lean startup, like I'm actually everything I'm saying when people read it, usually they don't disagree. They're like, yeah, this is all obvious.
but they don't
But
do
if
it.
it's all obvious, how come it's 2020 and 80% of startups, from what I see, are still making the same
They
mistake, right?
don't.
It's like I
People.
still get to pile on because I don't think people have gotten it enough, and I do receive the feedback a lot of like, oh yeah, everything you're saying makes perfect sense. I don't disagree, and yet it was still like a flash of insight for me to read it.
No, but I actually what I found was I loved your blog, and the reason to that was because although these things have been said, but they've been said in like I mean with the book Lean Startup, it's said it in a freaking 300-page book in like a couple of pages over there, right? It's not been focused on. But when I'm reading your blog, you're like making it a big focus, and I'm like, oh shit, like I'm thinking about it very like because that's the focus of the blog. You know what I mean?
It's the focus of the blog. And also, look, one thing I'm doing is I'm just seeing examples. So I'll,
Yeah.
I'll pick on specific companies, right? Like I think one of my most recent posts was like this company, Openland, a YC company, smart founders. But I think that they're building a bloated MVP because I just don't see, it's supposed to be like a chat software for communities, but I'm just not really seeing like a single active community on the software, and they keep building features for it. I'm like, okay. So, I mean, these are like smart, they seem to be experienced, like talented founders, and from my perspective, they're just doing, they're not really creating that much value, and like, I don't get why they're doing things in that order. And I'm seeing a lot of examples of this, and the trend I'm seeing, like, I think that I'm usually right. So usually when I identify a bloated MVP, like sure enough, the company like stops working on it after like another year when they run out of funding. So like, it's just very interesting. I think cataloging specific examples and being like, look, this isn't just a theoretical concept. Like there's companies that have launched that are currently bloated MVPs. Like check them out. I think that's interesting content.
Very cool. So how can someone unbloat their MVP?
What about unbloating
Like
it?
how can like I say if a company how can they go about unbloating their MVP?
Sure, definitely. Yeah. So you basically have to think back to the first principles. Like you have to ask yourself the question of like, what is the core value transaction?
Right.
And I have this concept called a value prop story. So it's basically a before and after. It's a diff. You have to tell a story of like, tell me a specific person, ideally who are they, what's their name, like do you know them, and like a story about a specific day in their life, like oh yeah, the day when he has to go buy a house, and that's because he wants to move in with his wife or whatever. A specific day. Tell me the exact story before your product and then after your product. And then where most people fail is they fail because they never even say the specific user. They talk in general terms. Like no, make it specific. Like tell me who. Like go find one person and be like, he's an example of who you're talking about. And then they also fail because when they're telling the story, they gloss over the before picture. They're like, oh yeah, before he likes to walk down the street and step in dog poo and slap himself in the face. I'm like, no, that doesn't. I don't think that's what he wants to do. Like, don't you think he'd be a little smarter than that before, right? So they don't really dignify the before case and talk about what else it's possible to do without your product. And only then, if you're really being honest and telling the best before story, then you can tell the after story and see if there's like a big diff there.
Right, makes complete sense. So, example, in the case of blockchain housing you use, like before, like say if I'm buying a house, I would go to a realtor and let the realtor do most of the work. right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just like I was kind of making a
No,
BS
I
example,
know
but
you
let's
were. I know you were.
yeah, but even I can spitball with it. Like, let's say your pitch is that like blockchain is going to make the transaction like more anonymous and more seamless because you don't have to deal with like all the contracts, right, and like the regulation of the U.S. system. Okay, so let's specifically say like I bought a house in upstate New York last year. Okay, so let's see which part of my specific process would you have made easier, right? Like I'm trying to think. Well, I had like a closing meeting, right? And that took like an hour out of my day, right? I had to go and sit down and sift through all this paperwork. Like that was annoying. Getting the loan was annoying. So like which part are we talking about? Okay, you're going to simplify the closing meeting. Okay. So explain, like walk me through the whole process of your closing meeting. Oh, there's like a bunch of steps. How much time are we talking about? Oh, 45 minutes. So your whole delta is like a 1 hour meeting versus like 45 minutes on your thing. Like that doesn't seem like a big delta, right? So that's how I would compare.
Right. I'm buying a $500,000+ house. I don't care about an hour. It's, you know what I mean? Like, if it saves me 15 minutes, it's not that. And like
Yeah,
how, yeah.
exactly, right.
How,
That's part of it too. And so I think people aren't familiar with a rigorous way to basically measure value. Like
yep.
the value is the diff between the before and after story.
Yep.
And if you aren't rigorous about telling yourself the before and after story, if you're just thinking like it's going to be blockchain making home buying better, man, if you're just
Yep.
thinking in vague concepts, if you don't do the exercise of tell the before story, tell the after story, and really be honest, what's the diff? Then you'll probably just get high on your own supply and make a bloated MVP.
Makes complete sense. Awesome. I love the concept of following like the value, like it, right? So, as you said, like the value prop story, and you're right. I think the most biggest, like most owners that I meet, they're not doing that at all. They don't. I mean, it's crazy because I do marketing, right? So every time I talk to people, like, who's your avatar, who's your persona, who's buying from you, and these are people like who have millions in revenue. They don't know. Like, it's crazy. It's crazy to look at it. Um, like, how do you think? I would say it's been changing because we are from a startup world. Like, we learned this from lean startup and stuff like that. But like when you look at like normal, like not the startups, but like normal, like any kind of like e-commerce businesses or like info products or whatever, they're not doing that at all. Like, and so how do you like, think about that? Like, I think it's pretty interesting, but how do you think about how should they approach that?
Sure. Like an e-commerce business. I mean, I think everybody should approach using the same framework. I mean, even if you're like, even if what you do is like you're a painter, right?
Right.
You work for yourself and you want to go door to door and like get people to paint their houses for them. Like, no matter what you're doing, you have to understand how you're giving people value. And it's always going to come down to like, what would they do without you? And then what would they do with your help and like show them that delta, right? So I just think that exact same template works even if like you're an employee in the company. You're not even a startup founder. You're just a random employee and you're trying to get a promotion, right? So you got to tell your boss the before and after story of like, look, I could go work somewhere else, but then you'd probably end up doing this. But if I work here, then you can do this instead, and that's better.
Very interesting. Cool. I want to take an example of like my podcast, right? I want to see if I'm on the right track and what should I change and how do I approach it. I think it'd be a good case study here.
Yeah, definitely. So I think my advice for you would be like, okay, so your podcast. So like, give me a specific type of person who would listen. Like, am I a person who would listen to your podcast?
So I don't know, to be completely honest with you. That's what I'm trying to figure out right now. That's why I said it's the group part.
I think I might be. I think it might be because tell me if I'm in your demographic because I'm somebody who I listen to a good amount. I listened to This Week in Startups when YC was making episodes of their like official podcast. I've listened to that. I've listened to like How I Built This. Right. So I do have a history of listening to startup podcasts. And then, yeah, I also listen to like some random other podcasts. I listen to like some, I don't know, science podcasts and like business podcasts. And then like some investor podcasts. So I feel like, the YC Insider, and obviously like I'm very interested in YC and reading Paul Graham. So what do you think? Am I like in your target audience?
It's actually funny that you say that because I was not thinking about that. For some reason, I thought that people who were already like, YC startup founders and people who are already doing pretty well, my thought process was they probably would be following more like like YC's actual podcast or like you said like Guy Raz where they're hearing stories of like the Airbnbs of the world. My thought process was because we like I personally have made so many mistakes and I talked to a lot of like founders who made so many mistakes and a lot of people who were starting out, right? And the idea, at least my thought process was the idea was that stop like don't so that you don't make the same mistake like we all did while we were starting out, right? Like that's kind of what I was
Sure.
going for. So being
So you're saying I'm like too much of an insider, right? Or like too knowledgeable. So I'm not
exactly,
the perfect.
exactly.
Yeah.
So my example would be let's going in a specific person. My example would be let's say someone who's in university right now. Let's call this guy named I don't know this guy named Taylor. He's in university. He just he went through university startup. He took an entrepreneurship class. He wants to start his own business. and he's Googling around, how do I start a business, or how do I go remote, or whatever it might be, how do I start a startup, right? And now he's like, what, like, you can listen to all, you can go on YouTube and you can listen to all the advice in the world, but it's all about, like, for the most part, it's all about um, the, like, very generic, and it's all over the place. Like, how do I just like hone in into, like, I'm starting a startup, like, about the idea, about the failures, what to avoid, and, like, how can I learn from people, like, who are building startups, but they have also had a lot of failure, and that's kind of how I was thinking about it, at least.
Okay, so I think we can drill down on that a little bit, right?
Yeah. So that's a bloated MVP. There you go. You try.
Well,
I like how you be
I
polite.
think you have a really good start when you're talking about. It sounds like your ideal audience is people who are very interested in starting their own startup soon. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so that's already a pretty good niche because you can already, it's like narrow enough that you can be like, for this class of people who are very interested in starting their own startup, like what is the ideal content for them? Like what could really help them out? And I guess it's also worth saying, like, are you thinking more like inexperienced people, like people who don't have like a solid success under their belt?
Agreed. Yeah. That's what I'm thinking so far. I might be completely wrong,
Okay,
though.
yeah, I mean that's definitely a clearly defined niche, and I think it's fair to say that they probably are also listening to other popular startup podcasts, right? If that's their interest.
You can say that. Actually, with that being said, though, by the way, I'm actually also really like, I'm still trying to figure this out, but I also think it could also be that it's less about, like you said, what you said was amazing. Like, it's not only doesn't it only doesn't apply to the startup world, it also applies to your life in general, whether it's an employee, whether it's, like, going for like, whether it's someone trying to go remote. Like right now, I talk to a lot of people who really want to work remotely. Like, it's crazy how many people I talk to, right? And have their own thing so they can work from anywhere in the world. And
Yeah.
I feel like this it is so the part that, at least I think, advantage I have is that I come from a startup world and I can use that advantage in the remote world, right?
Right.
Whereas everybody who's working remotely, they don't have the startup advantage, and I think it's such an interesting advantage, right? And I think that's kind of what my thought process is, that these people who are always, like, buying courses on how to do drop shipping and info products, which a lot of them are garbage, is like, actually, how can they learn fundamentals so they're not, like, buying these, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so you're saying your audience might be people who have like other elements, right? Like they already have remote work experience, but they don't have founder experience. Is that what you're getting at?
I was getting at, like, they want to get to the remote work experience. So right now they just finished their schooling, they're stuck in the city, but they don't know what to do.
So you're saying maybe they're not just people who want to do their own startup. Maybe they're people who want to do something else with freedom, and this podcast is going to just help them, like, be more independent.
And yeah, exactly, and get them more conceptual stuff locked down so they don't make the mistakes in general. They think like a startup founder. That's kind of my thought process, at least.
Okay, got it. Think like a startup founder. But if that's the case, why did you make it so hardcore about YC startups?
Just because I wanted to only focus on one niche, right? And I think that there's, as you said when we started off, I feel like there's a lot of different niches. That's like, if you go online, you can find a lot of podcasts about entrepreneurship, about, like, different businesses and all that stuff. And I thought, like, as a YC community, there, again, being startups, I think we've learned so much with failure that I thought that was
Mhm.
very helpful. And it's so raw. You don't find that every time you go to, like, any kind of, you know what I mean?
So I think you're onto something with a YC niche. But when I ask myself, like, who are the most passionate people about listening to a podcast that has that YC affiliation, unofficial? I think it's like people who worship YC. Like,
Yeah.
I'm kind of a YC fanboy, and I have been for many years. And now, having been in YC, having been on the inside, and having the YC stamp, now I feel like, it's more like familiar. So it doesn't have like as much of a halo for me.
Right.
But I think that for many years, if I hadn't done it yet, I'd be more of like in the worship mindset of, like, YC is like God of startups. And I think there's still like thousands of people in the world like that, who have that aura of YC, who will like suck down any, YC insider content. And so because you've committed to being YC affiliated, like you've said, hey, I'm not going to do like random freelancers who have no connection to YC. If that's the case, then I would say you probably want to find like a cluster. You should probably realize that your best audience might be these YC worshippers.
Interesting. Good point. Yeah. So why do you think, and now talking about competitive advantage, why do you think someone would listen to this podcast and not the YC's official podcast?
Sure. Yeah, there's actually a bunch of reasons. I mean, number one reason is, when was the last time they put out an episode? Like a year ago?
I actually don't know.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I think there's a shortage of super, like if you ask me like what is the most YC related podcast episode that has come out in the last year, I don't think there's actually much. Like there's random YC founders who have been on random other podcasts, but they're not collected like this.
Oh,
So like
interesting.
I think you have a real niche. Like there's no question your niche is at least good enough for like 100 listeners. The
Yeah.
only question is, okay, is it 100,000? Like how big is the niche? But it's definitely a niche.
Very cool. Okay. See, that's awesome. Like talking to you about this makes me think about these questions. That's amazing. Uh,
Cool.
um, awesome. Let's move this on to like the whole YC. We're chatting about YC right now. So how was your YC experience? And according to you, because I get this a lot when I'm traveling, people ask me, why should I join YC? A lot of people are really like that even if they get in, they don't want to give away their equity or you know what I mean. So what value does YC offer according to you?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I do think that YC, a lot of what it offers is slowly getting unbundled. I do think that that's the trend. I think it started off very strong, and there was a point where it was growing in power, and other people weren't directly competing for a long time. And I still think they don't have any like super great direct competitors, but I do think that a lot of what they offer is slowly getting unbundled. So I'm very interesting to watch, like what is still their advantage. Um, but in terms of what YC offers, or do I recommend it? Like, I have no regrets about doing YC because it was a cool experience. Got to talk to a lot of smart people. I love being in like the inside, the YC Slack or the YC forum, Bookface. I think that's great. And having been such a YC fanboy my whole life, it was really. It was kind of like for me, it was like not if, but when am I going to do YC? Right? It's like a bucket list item. And I think one of maybe the single biggest value add they did is the demo day process and the idea of setting up an easier process to raise money. I do think that they made it, significantly easier to raise money. But the thing is that raising money is still hard even with YC.
Right.
So like I had the impression that if you do YC, you get such a powerful stamp of approval, right? You get like such a powerful brand name. Like, that's right, I'm the next Airbnb, Stripe, Dropbox. Like you're investing in the next Dropbox. But really, I think what they don't tell you directly is that if you look at any Y Combinator batch, right? If you look at the 200 companies and you take the median company, I think, is struggling to even raise $100,000 or $200,000.
Wow.
So you really got to start getting into like the top half or the top third of the batch to start seeing like the 500K, 1 million, 2 million, 10 million roll in. Like, so that outcome happens every batch, but you just don't hear about the people who are like, yeah, we did YC and then we raised like 50K and then we spent it and then we shut down the company. That's like a very common YC story.
And did this happen like lately as they have been expanding, or was it like always like this?
I think it was always like this. Like, I mean, well, there was that time when, when every company got the 150K automatically, but that's basically still the case now with 120K.
Right.
So I do think, like, I've never really heard somebody explicitly explain that if you're doing YC, and I don't know where the cutoff is, right? Maybe the bottom third is getting screwed. Maybe the bottom half is getting screwed. Maybe the bottom 2/3. I don't know where the cutoff is, but there's a very significant fraction of companies that go through YC, graduate, and then raise less than 100,000 and maybe even zero, even though they wanted to raise. Right. And look, whose fault is it? It might be their fault that like their product sucks, right? Like, yep. Or like their vision sucks. Like, I don't know what the deal is, but I will say there was a little bit of a mindset shift where when you do YC, you get a nice stamp of approval, but the stamp doesn't make it super easy to raise.
Right. Interesting. So I think it's also like this thing of like, would you call it like an over expectation in the sense? Like, you look at it, you're like, this was my dream. And then all of a sudden you're like, holy shit, we didn't raise any money. And like, it didn't mean as much as we thought. Do you think that could be? It's also one thing a lot of people feel?
Well, so like I said, for me, there was a perspective shift because I just thought it's like, look, me and my co-founder, it's like, look, you're investing in two smart people who have a product with some traction. Like, this is a slam dunk. Like, I just expected that when we went out to raise, just because we checked the box, YC, check, somebody who's done a startup before and, who has a computer science degree, check. I thought we checked enough boxes that we'd be able to like go raise $1 million or $2 million and it wouldn't be that hard, right? Like that was my calibration. Right. And now I've recalibrated to be like, okay, well, it's definitely doable. And the fact, right, like it's doable with hard work. And the fact that it's doable is already incredible because like, look, $1 million is a lot of money.
Yep.
So it's not like impossible, but I've recalibrated to be like, it's not easy either. Yep. So like when we first went out for fundraising post YC, we ended up scrapping together. It took us like 3 months to get to like 500K, which doesn't sound too bad. It's like, okay, that's like respectable, I guess, for like a couple months old company. But also I had an advantage, which is a couple acquaintances, people that I've known in the past, like Jan Talin, the first employee of Skype, and Alex from Funders Club, like these people who are like pretty big investors, happened to know me and saw that I was pitching on demo day. And so we reconnected. And so that's already like a huge leg up in the fundraising process,
Right.
because getting a stranger to give you money is so much harder than getting somebody that you have any relationship with. And it's funny because I'm not like a networking guy. Like I suck at networking, and yet it was my network that came through with like those first two checks. I joke, it's like, okay, this is tapping into my white privilege, basically, of why we're able to jumpstart the fundraising round.
Interesting. By the way, I love shout out to Alex and Boris. Yeah, they were investors in our company too. They're awesome guys.
For sure, yeah,
So
definitely one of the highest quality investors you can get.
100%. That's awesome. It's very interesting to, yeah, I see what you're saying, and I never thought about this either. Like this concept of like how so many people are not raising. Actually, I had an episode with Kwame. He started a company called Mental Happy, and he said the same thing. I never really picked up on it because he never like went this deep. But what you're saying, that because they only raised about a couple of $100,000, and for me, I don't know why, I don't know where this comes from either, but I've always heard like usually most of the people will raise at least $500,000 to $1 million when they come out of YC for some reason. And I don't
There's
really
like that macho. It's kind of like, yeah, that's right. I did YC. Like, yeah, everybody tries to play it cool, right?
Right.
Like, and you kind of have, when you think of a YC company, it's, at least this is my mental image. It's somebody who's like acts cool in the whole batch, plays hard to get with investors, and walks away with like at least $1 million. Like you got to get into the seven figures after you're done YC.
Yeah.
And if you haven't done that, it's like you failed YC. That's kind of like my mental image.
Yeah. Makes sense. But I think it's also good if it's the way it is, right? Because it makes you kind of do the hard work. You're not getting like, it's not like, hey, I just got in, so I should receive the money because it's owed to me in that sense. Like you actually have to go out and do the work and show value.
Totally, yeah. And and don't get me wrong, I think that like objectively, is it easy or hard to raise capital? I think it's like a good level. Like I think it's easy enough to raise capital if you have a good pitch. But the original point that I was making is, well, look, where's the value out of YC? It's definitely there, right? The fact that I got to be on demo day, like we did raise money from one or two complete strangers, which, like I said, is like doing the impossible. Like meeting a stranger with an early stage company and getting a check from the stranger, it's freaking hard. Like compared to having a relationship where they believe in you. If you don't highly believe in the founder, right, and you're giving them a check, it's like, okay, well, you better really love the idea and hope that they don't pivot and they work on it like nonstop for years. Like you're taking a big risk.
Yeah. I would also. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so we did get one or two strangers. We got a 100K check, which later became like 350K from Jonathan Ehrlich and Foundation Capital. So he was one of the people who I didn't have an existing relationship with, who took a gamble on us, which I appreciate. But I feel like there was an element of luck. Like we could easily, we met one or two strangers like that who ended up taking the plunge. That number, we talked to like 50 investors. So like 1 out of 50, it could have easily been 0 out of 50. And then I would have felt like a total failure. Whereas now I feel like, a moderate success, but it's like luck.
Makes sense. I actually will add one more point. I think the safes is also pretty cool. Like being from Canada, like, man, I have some friends who went out and raised investment, and like for a small amount, like the legal paperwork they have to go through and all the drama they have to go through, I'm like, wow. And the safes make it so much easier. I am a big fan.
Safes are great. I mean, the whole idea, they completely take an axe to the idea that you need to like raise a funding round. It's just like, look, you want to put money in, like, go ahead. Here's like a valuation cap, and you can give me this much, like, and you don't expect to get anything back for 10 years. Take it or leave it.
Yeah, that makes sense too, though, right? If you're getting $300,000 or $400,000, I'm either gonna like die trying, or I'm gonna like blow that money. I'm not giving you a 400K back, like, you know what I mean? So I don't need, like, safes makes so much more sense, because if we are gonna be growing, we're gonna be raising a Series A, simple as that, and you'll get your equity.
Yeah, and when you give the value prop pitch for what a safe does, I mean, the next best alternative before the safe was created was either a price round, which is like, okay, now you have to give away a freaking board seat. You have to take a lot of money, right? You have to take enough to be good for like a couple of years. And then the other alternative was a convertible note. I would say a safe is closer to a convertible note, but it's ridiculous that you have to like start paying interest, or you have to like pay back the balance. It's like, who are we kidding? That wasn't the idea, right? It's just like a random technicality.
Makes complete sense. Awesome. I want to talk about the remote. You manage a team of 100 plus employees now remotely, right?
Employees and contractors, yeah.
Right. Okay. We had Sarah from Safety Wing in the last episode talking about future of work and remote working. What are your thoughts / advice on building a startup remotely? I'll tell you what she said, by the way. She said that she predicts that, or economist predicts that by 2035, 1 billion people will be working remotely, which I was like, wow.
I mean, for me, this is just like the most obvious topic in the world. Like, I'm surprised there's even like controversy around it. Like, it's so obvious that remote work is like most of the white collar work that's going to get done. And like some of the obvious arguments are like, if you look at any big company, right, like Google, whatever, they already have multiple offices, right? Or
Right.
like the same office, they already have like multiple campuses, right? Are they really going and like flying around and seeing people in person? Like, no, most of their meetings are effectively conducted remotely anyway. So like to me, it's always been like the most ridiculous thing that people are arguing that like, okay, two people from different buildings like walk through the campus and like sit down on a bench and talk to each other and like that creates like this amazing value for the company. It's like, no, it doesn't. Just stay in your office and like Skype each other. Are you kidding me? Like that's obviously good enough.
I remember you also have an article which you sent me back. I don't know if you remember this or not, but you sent me a blog you wrote which was about the how to like avoid the phone calls or the video meeting. You remember
Blog post called "I Hate Phone Calls." Yeah, so
that?
like not only do I think that people shouldn't like work in the same building,
Yeah.
I also think that collaboration, like the idea of okay, let's all get on this call and collaborate. I also think that's highly overrated, especially like then the worst is like a sales demo, right? Which is like, hey, we have this great, you really should sign up for this product and let me walk you through it. Let me set up a 30-minute call to walk you through and explain the value. That's the easiest, that was what my post was about. My post called I Hate Phone Calls. I always reply and be like, look, can you just email me whatever deck you're going to walk me through? And then I'll just spend like 1 minute skimming the deck because I don't need like a tidal wave of information. Like I get the gist. And in general, not only do I not want sales phone calls, but I think that there's a pattern that a lot of people have wrong in how they do things, which is like when they want to discuss something, they're like, okay, I'm going to put a meeting on your calendar to discuss something. But then when somebody wants that, sometimes I'll say, okay, but I'll keep trying to like get the actual meat of the content before the meeting. So I'll be like, okay, great. In preparation for that, do you mind let's say the meeting is like on Friday and it's Monday. I'll be like, hey, tomorrow, Tuesday, can you just send me like an outline of like the main ideas you want to talk about? Okay, great. And then I'll just like start asking them questions about the outline. And then by the time the meeting comes, it's like the meat's already been handled, like I had scheduled. And then I just like call them like, hey, so we went through this, like, yeah, anything else? And then we just talk about like those last things that like aren't like the core structural meat, but they're just like extra talking and like social, being like, okay, we're on the same page, great. And then the call is like shorter than you expect.
Makes sense. Awesome, man. I have this last question for you. It's something I think you have. I think you. I want to ask you this because you have so much information in this because of your company you're building. You see so many relationships. You see so many issues with, like people having problems with their partner, with their family. What does the future of relationship looks like? Like, what do you think a modern relationship is going to look like 10 years from now?
Yeah, totally. So I think we're already seeing a lot of trends. Like, I don't even think you need to add any new trends. I think the trends that are already underway are enough to like keep transforming things. So, for example, the trend of like people don't feel like they need to meet somebody super local anymore, right? They can be farther away. They can have more long distance relationships, or it's worth flying one person in, or it's worth moving. I think that's a trend that's well underway, almost like a remote relationship.
Wow.
Another trend is just like people being more honest and open and having a wider variety of preferences. So before it was kind of like you had to take the mainstream preferences, like you have to find somebody of the opposite sex and get married, right? The menu used to have like one item, but now there's like so many menu items. Like, oh yeah, of course, girls have to experiment with girls before settling down with a guy. I'm not saying that's
Yeah.
like the trend, but stuff
Right.
like that where it's like more menu options are opening up. I think humans are diverse, right, and they have diverse preferences, and I think
Right.
it's becoming more and more okay to like express a wider and wider set of preferences. It's like the same thing, right? It's like with food, right? Like before, I would have just had like like a mall down the street and like a food court and a mall down the street, whereas now I have like DoorDash with like 100 restaurants, and I just order exactly what I want, and sometimes I even DoorDash from two places at the same time. And I think that's how people are going to be with dating. So they're gonna express their preferences. It's interesting to see what will happen with long-term marriage. Now that people are so used to getting what they want, it's interesting. Like, what are the chances that you're going to get what you want from the same partner for 50 years? Maybe
Right.
it'll become more like, well, a marriage is more like a 10-year contract. This is me just like speculating, right? That might
Yep.
become a little bit more common just because preferences change. Another relationship trend is just like the prevalence of like texting and not meeting people from your social circle. So like
Right.
when you want to just like meet somebody new and like start a life together, it's all about the texting, man. Like you have to send good texts because that's where it begins. And it's funny because everybody likes to act like texting is like the most casual thing and like, oh, I'm just playing. I'm not serious. I'm just playing. It's like, no, you should be serious because like those first text messages that you're sending, just shooting the shit, those could
Yep.
change your life.
Makes complete sense. Very interesting. Um, I one thing though I felt, and I think we've seen this with this growth in mental health, with like better help, like helping like people okay with saying I need this, I need the help. that I'm feeling something, like in my life, and I want to improve on this, or I'm going through something. I feel that that same trend is going to come to relationships because it's such an important area of our life, and we don't do anything. We don't learn anything about it. Like, while growing up, we never talk about it. Obviously, we're becoming more open now, but where do you see that happening in the next 10 years? The people being open to, obviously you're seeing the trends because that's the company you guys at your company does that, right? Lets people talk to coaches and improve. How much do you see that evolving in the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, related to what you're saying, it's kind of like quantified self, right? It's like a Fitbit for your relationship,
Exactly.
like relationship health. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's going to happen more and more. I think there's so much room for improvement in relationships. Like most people aren't even opening up. Like when we talk to people, a lot of times their problems, like we have like a guide to how to that we give our coaches of like familiarizing like the most common problems. And like people's problems are very complex and unique, but they also fall into like very common categories, right? And then the people themselves are clueless about the categories. Like if you take my area of expertise, like dating, like there's a lot of guys who like come off like way too desperate and like send these huge texts. And like you just sent a wall of text. Like and 1 in 5 guys has like the same issue. Like you send a wall of text and you look desperate and lame. Right. So it's like so people don't even realize there's so much low hanging fruit. So like my point is you've kind of said something about like that's a little farther down the line of like, yeah, everybody's going to have a Fitbit for their relationship. They're going to know exactly what's wrong. They're going to get the checkup. That is a good ideal. But for now, I feel like a
Yeah,
lot of people just need like the emergency room. Like they have like these big obvious problems that they need to wake up to.
makes complete sense. Yeah, kind of like it will happen, but we're really early right now. I don't know. I think I was watching a podcast with Andreessen Horowitz, and he said anything that you can think of in will happen. It's just about the timing, which
Sure.
was so interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's definitely fair to say. Yeah. I mean, it's just like if you're describing something and it sounds good and it doesn't sound physically impossible, then I agree. It's just a question of when.
When, yeah, makes sense. Awesome, man. I want to end this with the 4 quick fire questions that I do with everybody. So we'll start with this, only 1 or 2 sentences. We'll start with the first one. What's the one unconventional thinking outside the box you guys did in either of your businesses?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a lot. Let's see. One thing is, I guess I'll say we scaled up just by running ads
Yeah,
because everybody says like, hey, if you're doing a startup, you need to have like a growth advantage. And for ours, we just like ran ads. Like we didn't do any, we don't have any growth advantage.
awesome. And just for you viewers, you guys spend a lot of money on ads. Yeah, we're spending millions of dollars on ads. So that's something which is amazing. I love that. Um, advice for someone applying to YC.
Yeah, so I guess focus on telling that value prop story. And I think the best advice I've seen is just like if you look up like startup school with Dalton, who's their head of admissions, just explaining it, and it's just like just make it really easy to understand how you give people value. Like that's really all I can say.
Awesome. We'll link that episode down here. Advice for someone starting their first startup.
Yeah, I would refer you to Bloated MVP
All
and be
right.
like,
I love
if
it.
you're building a startup, then the core of the startup, it's not building a product, it's giving people value.
Love this. If there was only one thing that people could take away, something that has helped in your life a lot, what would that be?
Hmm. Yeah, I'll just I'll stay on the same theme. I think just understanding that it's like it pays to give people value and
Yep.
like understand what that means. Work through some examples and like go create value.
Awesome, man. You know what? I want to add one point to that. I'm actually interviewing Kong next
Oh
week,
yeah,
and
jump cut.
yeah, from Jump Cut, and he had I think it's 7 or 8 years ago. I asked him like, "What's one thing you can teach me?" And his quote was he learned it from somebody. He said the best way to be greedy is to be generous. So
Sure.
I love that because the whole value, it's all about giving value, and the more you can do that, the easier it becomes with everything.
And just the reason is because life is full of these win-win transactions, right? These non-zero sum games. So like if this was like an all-out war, I wouldn't be like, yeah, you should go give your enemy value. I'd be like, no, you should
Yeah,
fucking stab him.
yeah.
But luckily, there's a lot of win-win. Like there's plenty of win-win out there.
That's awesome, man. Man, thanks so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. And good luck identifying that exact niche. And I'll keep listening passionately.
And I'm definitely gonna be bugging you and asking for advice.
Good.
Cool, man.